another episode of Sustainability Uncovered. I'm your host, Nee. As always, I am joined with my deputy, Kelsey. You right, Kelsey?
I'm alright. How's everyone? I hope everyone's good.
Good. So today's topic, we're looking at the ocean today, and more specifically, the plastics within the ocean currently. And our special guest today is one of the world-leading marine scientists and a professor of marine biology at Plymouth Uni. His research about the causes and the impacts of marine litter over the past 20 years or so have been truly groundbreaking and is recognised globally. Please welcome Professor Richard Thompson OBE.
Hi, thank you for having me.
No worries. Thank you for joining us today, Richard. It's an absolute pleasure. Talking about marine litter, what caused you to study it? As a marine biologist, your first point of call is essentially, especially back then, to look at plastics in the ocean.
Yeah, so I was studying for my PhD actually, and I had lots of experiments out on the shore in the intertidal, and I was looking at those experiments every day, looking at the marine life in them, which is what I was planning to study. But unfortunately, almost every day I got items of litter arriving, getting tangled up in the experiments, and I started removing it, and it kept coming back, and I got really curious about where was all this litter coming from. Most of it was plastic. And so I started working with voluntary groups cleaning up the shoreline. I worked with Marine Conservation Society, and we helped them to organize a lot of cleanups in the area where I was. And because I was training to be a scientist, I started collecting the data. I got very interested in the data. I got to put it into spreadsheets. I started to think more and more about where's it come from? What are the types of plastic? And most of all, what can we do to help to tackle the problem? That's what got me interested in the topic. I guess during that time, there was probably a key observation that I made, which was nobody was at all interested in the very small stuff. They weren't part of the recording, the data sheets. In fact, actually, if I watched most of the volunteers, they were motivated by going for the biggest items they could find, rolling a large tire up the beach or getting a fishing net, which of course was important. But all of this small stuff was being neglected. So when I started to teach students myself, I set some of them the challenge. I said, forget about the big stuff, go and find me the smallest items of plastic on the beach. And that's really what started the story of microplastics. From that work by those students, it led to the first paper on microplastics, which we published in 2004.
Most definitely. For people who don't know, what are microplastics?
So yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, when we first described these really small pieces, very few people had described very tiny bits of plastic in the environment at all. We were talking about pieces that were truly microscopic. You needed a microscope literally to see them. And so that was the first paper ever to use the term microplastics. It was published in Science in 2004 in the journal Science. We didn't really define them. We just said, look, there's these small pieces out there. We've been able to show that they'd increased over time using archived samples of plankton samples, actually. And the interest in the topic grew. And then a few years later, there was the first policy meeting, if you like, that followed from that. And the policymakers were asking the question, well, does this small plastic, it's microplastic, does it give different types of harm? Could it result in different sorts of harm? And they realized, of course, that we needed to try to define it. There was quite a long discussion at that meeting. It was in America. And, you know, strictly speaking, the scientific definition for micro would be less than a millimeter. But that policy group decided that actually they wanted to adopt something slightly different and go for pieces of plastic less than 5 millimeters. And the reason they did that was it was kind of operationally defined that they thought that those small pieces, and they chose less than 5 millimeters, might have harmful effects in different ways to the larger stuff that we already knew could cause entanglement. The pieces less than 5 millimeters would be readily ingestible by a wide range of creatures. And so the upper limit of microplastics has since then really been set at 5 millimeters. There isn't really a lower size limit. That's limited actually by the ability to analyze plastics from the environment. And we don't have analytical equipment really to go much below about 10 or 20 microns to pull a piece back from an environmental sample, a fish or a sediment, and confirm that it's plastic. But most scientists in the field actually believe there'll be much, much smaller pieces right down into the nanoscale of plastic litter contaminating the environment today.
Absolutely fascinating. If you had to name a couple of causes of microplastics, what would it be?
So there are a variety of sources of microplastic, and we don't have the absolute numbers on the relative importance. We can speculate at them. And it's clear there are some direct inputs of microplastic, so pieces that enter the ocean already in the microplastic size range. And in that, you could include, for example, the microbeads in cosmetics, that it was actually research from the University of Plymouth that's one of the main contributing pieces of evidence that led to the government policy to prohibit that, the use of microbeads in rinse-off cosmetics in the UK. We also know that there are fibers from textiles and particles from the wear and abrasion of tires. But actually, if you look at the major uses of plastic, and we're making 360 million tons of plastic globally every year, 40% of everything we make is going into packaging, mainly to single-use applications. And if we look at the bigger items of litter on beaches, most of those are packaging related, single-use related items. And we know that those larger items are fragmenting in the environment. They're not necessarily biodegrading, but they're breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces. So if you ask me, what's the main contributor to microplastics? I would say it's those larger items, those everyday items, be it a bottle of lemonade or a crisp packet, breaking down over time into smaller and smaller pieces. And that's why action that we can all take at home, in our daily lives to make sure that we don't drop litter or don't let litter enter the marine environment are really important.
Yeah, very important. I think you did say that we all play a role in ensuring that we don't put this into our oceans, but how does it directly affect the ocean? Why is it such a problem?
So we know that large items of litter have a wide scale effect, and they can be damaging to the economy. We know that in the UK, for example, we're probably spending £20 million every year in cleaning up plastic litter. That's not from all of our shorelines. It's just from a small proportion of the shoreline that people care about for economic reasons, tourist beaches, ports and harbors, for example. It's estimated in the US on the West Coast, it's about $500 million every year. Now, I think this problem is totally avoidable, and I would far rather that money was spent on better things, grants for students, salaries for professors, equipment for universities, roads, schools, hospitals, than spending it unnecessarily on cleanup. So there is an economic cost. It's also clear that there's wide-scale effects on wildlife. We know that from the larger items of litter, hundreds of different species are affected negatively. And there's also emerging evidence of effects on human health and well-being, that even relatively small quantities of litter on beaches can reduce what the psychologists I work with would call the restorative value of our engagement with the natural environment. We go to the seaside, it normally makes us feel good. Small amount of litter makes us feel less good. But then you come to the microplastics, and we have a less complete picture there than for the bigger items. But if you take my point that it's the big items that are fragmenting into smaller pieces, the microplastics, there's already a very clear reason to want to take action on those bigger pieces. The evidence that we have from laboratory studies shows that microplastics have the potential to cause harm as well, to affect the way that organisms feed, the way they get goodness from their food. We're still trying to understand the wider scale implications of this microplastics, but predictions suggest that if we don't start to take action now, in the next 50 years or so, we will see wide scale ecological harm from microplastics, and that will come on top of the existing harm that we're already seeing from the macroplastic debris. So to me, it's really important that now's the time to act, because actually it's going to be almost impossible to remove microplastics from the environment once they get there.
Yeah, definitely, most definitely. What are the challenges in addressing the issue of plastic? Because literally all around us, like how can we challenge that?
So actually, it's a really interesting question, because many of the challenges that I face as a marine biologist, it's the very thing that us humans want that is directly coupled to some kind of damage to the environment. You think about taking fish from the oceans. Of course, we can try to do it sustainably, but the afternoon after we've been fishing, there will be less fish in the sea. You think about us wanting to live by the coast or take holidays by the coast. That will require buildings that directly take away natural habitat. The thing we want is intrinsically linked to some form of potential damage to the environment. But if you think of the uses of plastic, and I'll be really clear about this, I don't think plastics are the enemy here. It's not about not using plastics. Plastics have the potential to reduce our footprint on the planet. You think of lightweight parts in cars and aeroplanes. You think about even the packaging that will extend the life of food and drink and reduce food wastage. You think of the applications in hospitals and in schools. But all of those applications could be achieved. We could get the benefit without this release of waste and litter at the end of the item's lifetime. So there isn't a direct coupling between the benefit to society and the harm to the environment. Putting it another way, it's entirely feasible to have those benefits without the impacts. So it's not about not using plastics, it's about being much smarter about the way we use plastics than we have been in the past.
Yeah, you mentioned about like having to use plastics in a different way than we are now. How is it possible to use plastics without the unintended side effects that they cause at the moment?
Yeah, and in a way, the answers are not new, and this is why it's such a frustration to me that the progress has been so slow. Yes, some of it is about reducing our use of plastics. It's definite that we've got some applications where we maybe didn't need the plastic in the first place. The microbeads in cosmetics, for example, did we need to be cleansing ourselves with millions of small pieces of plastic? Do we need a plastic drinking straw every time we buy a soft drink when we're in a pub or a restaurant? No, we don't, of course. Do we need to throw away single-use carrier bag every time we go to the supermarket? No, we need to go prepared with our own bag that we can reuse. So reduce is important. Reuse is also important, as the example with the shopping bag there. But there's a limit to how far we can go with reduce and reuse. There are some applications where it's very clear that plastic will be the best material to do the job. And in those instances, what we need to do is to make sure that the plastics that we used are designed with end of life in mind. And unfortunately, when I speak to the product designers, they tell me it was never in their brief. They've never been asked to even think about designing plastics with end of life in mind. They've been asked to design for functionality and for products that are attractive to the consumer, but not with end of life in mind. And so if I take a really simple example of a plastic bottle to bring you a soft drink, it's made of a polymer called PET. That's probably the best way to bring you this drink. It's far lighter than using glass, for example. And PET is a polymer that we've known for decades. It's highly recyclable. In essence, the PET bottle could go round and round again, bringing drink after drink in new bottles. But unfortunately, the designer in this particular case has chosen to put a red pigment in that bottle. It doesn't make it unrecyclable. It makes it much more challenging to recycle. So the information to the consumer on this bottle is exactly the same as for a clear PET bottle. So it is recyclable. The information to the consumer isn't wrong, but actually what the designer has done, through a lack of thought or a lack of care, is to render it very challenging economically to recycle. Because when I talk to the recyclers, they'll tell me that the presence of the pigment in this bottle approximately halves the value in recycling, because they can do far more things with a clear recyclate from a clear soft drink bottle than they can from the coloured bottles, which create a really diverse mixture of different colours mixed together. So the clear PET is the way forward. And we've seen some brands starting to move increasingly towards clear bottles. And I'm really pleased to see that. I saw adverts around Plymouth just last year for a popular brand of lemonade that's saying the new green is clear. You might have seen them. The frustration to me is that in Japan, where they realized this nearly 20 years ago, all of their PET bottles have been clear for decades. And we've seen the recycling rates and the circularity of the material go up as a consequence. Why is it that we're lagging so far behind? Why is it that designers are failing to recognize the importance of designing for end of life so that more and more of our everyday plastics can move around in a circular economy? It's really important that we get the plastics to do that. It has a twofold effect, because actually the carbon source of the plastic is mainly non-renewable oil and gas. It's going through short-lived applications to waste. So if we can get the plastic to go round and round in a circle, we decouple ourselves from the fossil oil and gas, and we decouple ourselves from the waste and the litter at the other end. So we get a real win-win here. And I would say here, because of course we're talking about marine litter, but the litter in the environment and in the sea is really just a symptom of this wider problem that we're using all this resource in a linear way. We're using plastics that are incredibly durable for short-lived applications that bring societal benefit, but that benefit is short. The persistence as waste is really long. And because we're doing it in a linear way, essentially we're designing things not to have any value. And that can lead to littering. The litter we see in the environment is in essence plastic that's escaped waste management. We've buried beneath the ground and burnt in incineration far more plastic than there is in the marine environment, for example. But I don't consider burying that resource or burning it really much better solution. What we need to do is to get the carbon going around in a more circular way and make sure we've designed plastic products to make sure that that's economically viable.
Yeah, most definitely. It's mad that to think that when they designed these plastic bottles, it wasn't even in their brief to look at their lifespan of like how long the plastic is used. You spoke briefly about how Japan have already like moved and shifted that way. Why do you think it's so hard over here for that shift of focus to happen?
I think we're making progress, but I think there's a real kind of conservativeness with a small c for brands. You know, if you've got a product on the supermarket shelf and people recognize that it's orange, blue, pink, green, whatever it is, there's a real nervousness about changing that brand recognition, that image. And that's why I think it can take, there's a lag involved. It was interesting when, going back a couple of years, there was an announcement by a government-linked organization called WRAP, which deals with waste and resources, and they announced the 8 most problematic items from a point of view of recycling. And I was at a meeting when that was launched with the industry, and the industry were a little bit kind of touchy that they were being picked on quite a lot. And I said, well, hang on a minute, which of those 8 items did you not know before you came to this meeting today were challenging to recycle? Oh, we knew about all of them. We knew all of those were challenging. Well, then I think there's been an element of having your head in the sand is my frustration here. I think the problem, the crisis of plastics in the environment has been growing year on year. It isn't something that's come up out of the blue. And so I get frustrated a little bit that industry in some quarters hasn't really maintained that progress. And I think if we're to try and solve the broader environmental challenges that face our planet, we need to have a wider duty of care, a wider responsibility with industry that actually it could become an offence to knowingly do something that's harmful to the environment. It shouldn't rely on scientists and people in my team to reveal the damage if actually you could be doing a better job. And the example I'd give there is back to the microbeads in cosmetics. It's great that work from students at the University of Plymouth have helped to bring that to attention and bring it to policy. But then I look at when the patent was first filed on using small bits of plastic in cosmetics. It was filed 50 years ago. Did nobody in the industry over those 50 years ever ask the question, where is it all going? And if we had, probably we could have seen this problem off years ago. It wouldn't have taken that evidence. It wouldn't have taken that deflection, that policy attention onto it. We could have seen it into the long grass. And to me, there is a real global challenge we've got with all sorts of environmental crises associated with the growing human population, that I feel we have to have a different way of working that looks to use the planet and the planet's resources in a more responsible manner. And that there's an onus on industry, if they know that they could be doing a better job, to take those steps rather than waiting for somebody to come with the evidence.
Definitely. You spoke a lot about our lifestyle affects this whole chain. So would you say that students can play a major role in this? What would you say students can do to address this issue?
I think students are a really important voice. And, I can remember when I was a student and I got quite active about various environmental campaigns. I mean, of course, we can try to reduce our use of plastics. We can try to make sure when we're allowed back onto the campus, we can take a refillable coffee cup with us rather than having a throwaway one. We can reuse things in that sense for our sandwiches or whatever it might be. We can reduce the use of unnecessary plastic. And maybe with the plastics that we do need, we can choose to buy plastics, products in plastics that we know are locally recyclable, and then make sure that we take those steps to recycle the plastic at the end of its lifetime. More broadly than that, we can also raise awareness, of course, with our friends and our family about trying to do the same. Now, there's a frustration for me that I think we could do a lot more as citizens, whether we're students or whoever we are, if industry was supplying us with products that had got end of life in mind. But that doesn't mean it's hopeless right now. Reduce, reuse, recycle, buy things in packaging that can be recycled locally. All of those things are very doable.
Yeah. Do you think that students talk about this enough? Do you think it's a conversation that's happening? Do you think there should be more conversation happening?
The students that I meet certainly talk about it a lot, but then maybe I get a biased sample if we think about it from a scientific perspective. But I think students are well aware of the problem, and I think, you know, they're really keen to take steps to do the right thing.
Most definitely. What would you say are 2 key points that you want people to remember and take away from all that you have said today?
I think plastics are not the enemy here. Plastics can bring societal benefit. It isn't about not using plastics. It's about using them more responsibly. That can be achieved, but it's going to take us all working together. That's industry, policy, and the general public. In terms of things we could do today or tomorrow, as citizens, as students, reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yeah, that's definitely key points to take away from this if you can adopt those in your everyday life. We asked this question to everyone that comes onto our podcast, and we were wondering how, like, your work at the university and like everything you've done, how does that fit in the wider UN sustainability goals?
Well, it certainly addresses SDG 14 at helping to address the challenges of life below water, but actually it will address a wider range of sustainability goals, from using less non-renewable resource to generating less waste. It affects life on land as well as in the water. I think that plastics can be used to help to alleviate, to reduce poverty. It's about using them responsibly. And actually, you know, plastics have a key role in addressing many of those goals. You think of lightweight parts in cars and airplanes to reduce carbon emissions, or plastics in solar panels, plastics that can help bring food and water to people worldwide. The plastics are key to this, but it's about using them responsibly and making sure we don't damage the environment in the way that we use them.
Yeah, definitely. It's the key takeaway from this. Thank you so much for joining us today, Richard. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And thanks for organising this. I think it's absolutely fantastic.
No worries. Thank you so much.